In part 6 of this lecture, we're going to learn more about some of the tests that IO psychologists use to measure individual differences. The first example is a work sample test, which is exactly what it sounds like. People are asked to perform a job task in realistic conditions. Remember that this is the most predictive of selection tests, and that's because it most closely matches the job. On the slide, you can see examples of motor work samples and verbal work samples. We might require computer programmers to actually program software, or we might ask foreign language students to have a discussion in the language they're trying to learn. In addition to being valid predictors for most types of job performance, work sample tests have high face validity, are difficult to fake, and are less influenced by things like age and gender. Plus, they are the easiest to defend in court. One of the limitations of work sample tests is that they only measure what people already know. They don't tell us what people are capable of learning. And they're relatively expensive to develop and administer. Many of you are familiar with interviews. When we use structured interviews, we ask every applicant the same set of questions, and we follow a detailed protocol so that we can standardize the process. Every applicant has a similar experience in the interview. There are two specific types of structured interviews that we might want to use. Situational interviews ask applicants to describe how they would respond to some hypothetical situation, how they might act in the future. Behavioral description interviews ask applicants to describe how they've behaved in the past, how they've handled certain situations. Tell me about a time when you managed a conflict, or tell me about a time when you overcame an obstacle at work. When interviews are structured, they can be valid predictors of many different outcomes. They tend to have high face validity in that people expect them to be part of the selection process. Interviews also allow for a two-way exchange of information. Not only are we collecting data from the applicants, they also collect information from the organization. Anytime we use interviews, we need to make sure the interviewers have been trained. The development and administration process can be expensive, and it's relatively easy for applicants and employees to fake their way through an interview, especially when we don't follow up and verify the information they told us. Cognitive ability tests are another option. These measure people's ability to learn, reason, comprehend, and perceive stimuli in their environment. For example, we could use the Wonderlic personnel test. We might also use cognitive test batteries, collections of cognitive ability tests. For example, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, the ASVAB, or the General Aptitude Test Battery. Here are some examples from the Wonderlic personnel test, the revised version. The good news about cognitive ability tests is that they are one of the best predictors for a wide variety of outcomes. They are especially useful for complex jobs. They are easy and cost-effective to administer, and they're relatively difficult to fake. Unfortunately, cognitive ability tests have shown some evidence of favoring majority groups over minority groups, and the development of these tests can be costly and time-consuming. Knowledge tests are most similar to the quizzes and exams that you take in college. Knowledge tests are job specific. They measure knowledge of information that someone in that job would be expected to know on day one. These tests often include multiple choice items or sometimes essay items. The best ones are customized for the job, for the organization. This type of test is often used at the state and federal level for licensing and certification purposes. As you can imagine, knowing job-relevant information should predict future performance. These tests also tend to have high face validity, they're difficult to fake, and the administration process is cost-effective. The downsides to using knowledge tests are that they must be frequently updated to keep up with industry changes. They may not be appropriate if the knowledge that's being tested could be learned on the job. And like cognitive ability tests, knowledge tests are also expensive to develop. IO psychologists use integrity tests to measure attitudes and experiences related to honesty, dependability, trustworthiness. There are two basic types of these tests. Overt integrity tests come right out and ask people about their attitudes and experiences. Personality-based integrity tests are a bit more covert and infer someone's level of honesty based on their personality scores. Integrity tests can be valid predictors of different outcomes. They tend to be less influenced by demographics than cognitive ability and knowledge tests. They tend to be easy and cost-effective to administer. We often buy them off the shelf already developed. Because applicants don't get to see their scores, they don't always like the results of their test. The more overt versions are easier to fake, and interestingly enough, personality tests tend to be better predictors of counterproductive work behaviors, things like stealing, lying, and gossiping. Personality tests are designed to measure personality, stable patterns of behavior in the workplace. There are two different types of personality tests that we might use, and the distinction is important for legal reasons. Screen-in tests measure normal personality and can be administered as part of the pre-employment process. Examples include the Hoboken personality inventory, the NEO personality inventory. Screen-out tests are used to measure and diagnose psychopathology and can only be administered after a job offer is made. An example of one of these tests is the popular MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. To many people's surprise, personality tests are valid predictors of many outcomes and many different types of jobs. They are easy and cost-effective to administer, but the major problem is they're so easy to fake. And applicants don't really like them. They tend to have lower face validity because people cannot see the connection between questions about what they like to do on Friday night and their job performance. For jobs that require physical abilities, we can measure people's capacity to meet those physical demands. Physical ability tests often assess multiple characteristics at the same time, characteristics like strength, balance, speed. It's really important that these tests be validated and assessed for employment discrimination. Older applicants may be at a disadvantage due to the natural loss of muscle, stamina, and flexibility. Female applicants may also be at a disadvantage due to biological differences, like less muscle mass and less stamina on average. These tests are valid predictors in physically demanding jobs. They can be a useful screening tool in making sure that the applicant pool has the basic physical abilities that they need to do the job. They are extremely difficult to fake, but they are heavily impacted by age and gender. Plus, they can be relatively expensive to develop and administer. Assessment centers are collections of assessments. An assessment center isn't necessarily a place, it's a collection of assessments. This type of test is usually reserved for groups of applicants or top-level executives. A 1 to 2 day long process where they undergo numerous evaluations and are assessed by multiple raters, observers. Assessment centers are like work samples in that they require people to perform job duties in an environment that closely simulates the real work environment. People may be asked to create reports, provide recommendations. At the end of an assessment center, the test takers usually create reports or recommendations, and then they also receive feedback from the raters and the organization. Because assessment centers are so hands-on, they tend to be valid predictors of many outcomes and have high face validity. It's clear to most people how this test relates to the job. Assessment centers are focused on the observable, on behaviors that raters can see, instead of some internal state like personality or knowledge. The feedback component of assessment centers makes them especially useful for developmental purposes, like with helping employees plan their careers. Like interviews, assessment centers also require that interviewers and raters are trained, and they can be extremely expensive to develop and administer. Situational judgment tests are similar to situational interviews in that they ask people about future situations. What would you do if you were in this situation? The difference is that with judgment tests, the questions usually come in a multiple choice format. Whereas with the interview, applicants are expected to verbally articulate their response. You can see an example of a situational judgment test item on this slide. Because these tests include items that are highly related to the job, they tend to be valid predictors of many outcomes, and applicants generally perceive them as fair. Most importantly, they provide incremental validity above and beyond personality and intelligence tests. This means that these tests measure components of the job that personality doesn't measure and that intelligence doesn't measure. The problem is these tests are easy to fake and they are expensive to develop and administer. Drug tests are yet another option for some jobs. These tests are designed to measure traces of prohibited substances, whatever substances the organization wants to ban. They can be paper and pencil tests, which ask people directly, have you used these substances, yes or no? They can also be urine, hair, and or saliva tests. We can also use fitness for duty tests, where we test people when they first come into work to ensure that they are sober and that they can do the job in that moment. Drug testing can be a controversial practice in some jobs, but they are standard in public safety and transportation jobs. Like physical ability tests, drug testing can help us identify some of the people who cannot perform the essential job duties. Of all the selection tests available, this one is the most difficult to fake. Critics of drug testing point out that a positive result really doesn't tell the organization a whole lot about the substance use. The administration of a drug testing program is costly. It can cost anywhere between $50 and $100 per test, and that doesn't include the time and human resources involved in making the program work. Plus, there are a lot of legal concerns around this type of test. It could be one of the more controversial selection tests